Hi, my name is Olajide Olagunju, and I'm the author of the book, How to Resolve a Conflict, which is the book I would like to share with you on the screen now. That is this book. Um, it's the textbook for the lecture series you just joined. And the lecture series itself is titled How to Resolve a Conflict. And you are now in How to Resolve a Conflict, Lecture 46. Welcome, and I do hope you enjoy the interaction with us today. What we do is look at the book, read the text, and then have a discussion. We've been discussing the person of the mediator, and now we're looking at specific duties of the mediator. And more specifically, we're looking at how the mediator deals with principles, dealing with principles in mediation. So the mediator, I need to ask some 3, 4 questions. When issues of principles come up in his or her mediation, she needs to ask what principles are thought to be at stake, whose principles they are, whether the principles arose with the conflict or preceded the conflict, and finally, whether the principles are relevant to the resolution of the conflict. I think that we could take them one after the other. So, principles. These principles that are coming up in this mediation, what are they? In the sense of what is their relevance? How do they flow into the mediation? So we cannot ignore principles being floated or coming up because for the person or persons bringing them, they may be very important. So it's not our what we think of them that matters. It's what the perspective of the person bringing up the principles is their perspective that matters because they are the party in the conflict, and we need to help them look at those principles so that they could decide what they want to do with them. So, what principles are thought to be at stake very clearly? Principle A, principle B, principle C, whatever they are. We need to engage them. We cannot sweep them under the carpet. We need to confront them and look at them. We need to understand what the principles are that are important to the parties at this mediation. We need to also understand whose principles they are. Are they the principles of party A or the principles of party B or a shared principle? Also, are the principles coming up as the conflict is coming up, or were those principles there before? I think different approaches would arise depending on whether those principles are floated with the conflict. That's this person has developed these principles when the conflict arose, or they've always had those principles. They've always lived by those principles. Why is it important? If the principles are coming up with a conflict, then we need to ask ourselves, how important they are. Could they be defense mechanisms? I will bring them up as a way of engaging in conflict. And now that we're talking about mediation, resolving conflict amicably, will those principles still be important to us? Now if we are in the court or in other adversarial forum, yes, those kinds of principles that we bring up. So these principles, if you were in an adversarial forum, the principles coming up in the conflict will be principles that are kind of way of defending yourself, because everybody wants to win it by all means in the courts and at arbitration, because at the end of the day, the judge will decide who wins, who loses. So all manner of principles and other things may come up as part of the defense strategy, or the attack strategy. Now, if the principles were there before the conflict, then it becomes a different kettle of fish, and needs to be approached differently in terms of these principles. How do they impact on the conflict resolution process? How do they help us have a resolution that is holistic and takes care of all issues? So that is very important. Now, the other thing we need to look at in dealing with principles is whether the principles are relevant to the resolution of the conflict, which I already touched on. When I was talking about when the principles arose, were they always there? Is it known to the parties? Is it what they lived by? Was it important to them? Or it's just coming up as a part of the defense in an adversarial forum, in an amicable forum like mediation, which is the focus of our lecture. These principles will become important if they are the principles that have guided both parties or either of the parties, because if they are that important, then you can't just wish them away. They need to be engaged. They need to be looked at. They need to be looked at. It does not mean that they must be applied per se. We could unpack them. We could look at them and say, well, these principles, what are they? Where are they coming from? Can we really continue to hold on to them? And we could change. And if the mediator can, she should or he should be able to help them and critically examine those principles and determine whether or not they should be held on to, whether or not this process. So I think that's what we need to look at for now, dealing with principles. I'll just read a little bit more and then we'll have some more discussion. In one conflict, one party had leased equipment to the other party, which act the former party considered a favor to the latter party. When the lessee went to court against the equipment owner over the contract, the owner considered the lawsuit as being immoral for lack of gratitude. Thus, from the lessor's point of view, going to court against one's benefactor, in quotes, breaches a moral principle. A lawyer or judge would simply have said the principle was irrelevant, since a lease is not a social favor, but a binding contract between the two parties. The lessee, having furnished valid consideration, was entitled to have the contract enforced. However, a mediator knows that what is important or relevant to the mediator is not what matters. The issue is what the parties hold as important. Secondly, in the example just cited, the principle becomes even more relevant when viewed against the social environment of the conflict. A small town in Africa where people still felt very uncomfortable with lawsuits. Okay, so I just cited that example, from real life to show that principles are real. I'm sure we know they are real, but in conflict resolution, they come up. But the way a lawyer, a judge, an arbitrator may deal with it will definitely be different from the way a mediator will deal with it. Now, a lawyer, a judge, an arbitrator can waive the principle of in this particular case I cited, it's a moral person. And then the court would simply say, well, we're not here to enforce morality per se. Per se. So if you are saying in this specific example that this person ought not to have taken me to court because her elder sister or her brother, irrespective of the contract, the judge or the court will say, well, what's important for us here is the contract, not your relationship, not social relationship, and they will decide the case accordingly, according to the terms of the contract. A mediator cannot do that. And the reason I stated in the book is that a mediator knows that what is important or relevant to the mediator is not what matters. In the court, this moral principle that came up in this particular case of the lessee being seen as a beneficiary of the lessor, leading to the contract, will be irrelevant. For the mediator, the mediator doesn't say it's important, irrelevant or not relevant. The mediator tables it before the parties, discussing the parties, makes the party decide what they want to do with it. The truth is that moral principle, in quotes, may be what decides the outcome of the conflict resolution. Don't forget, in amicable conflict resolution, it's about what the parties decide, not what the mediator decides. The mediator is not a judge nor an arbitrator. And so if the parties say, well, this principle is important to us, the mediator has to help them look at it. They may end up saying, well, actually, it's not as important as we thought. Or they may say, yeah, it's quite important, and we need to look at it in determining how we want to resolve this dispute. I also said that the context and social environment of the conflict resolution of the mediation may be important. So the same case being judged in New York, not being judged, being mediated in New York, this principle may not be as important as when it is being mediated in a more rural area, any small town, or village, where the relationship between the parties has go far beyond the contract between them. So the venue or the forum or the background of the parties where they are coming from could also be important in how we treat the principles that may or may not come up. Because in the New York case, it could be assessed as a beneficiary situation. One person enters into a contract with another because they want to help. But when it becomes a conflict, in this specific case of New York, two business people. They didn't just decide to, let the court decide, but more importantly, they may decide that at mediation, that as a matter of fact, they may not even bring it up at all. They may not bring it up at all. Whereas in another forum, a more rural forum, a more traditional forum, it may be what is emphasized. And when we are talking about mediation, the mediator has to really engage it. Whereas if it was in the same rural forum, if it was a judge, he could just wave it off. But the mediator has to engage it. I think we could stop here for today, and then we'll move on to some other topic, which will be insecurity, issues of insecurity in mediation, in conflict resolution. We'll engage that in the next lecture. That will be tomorrow, and that will be lecture 47. Thanks again for joining me. Please subscribe to this channel, and send in your comments, and endeavor to read the book, How to Resolve a Conflict, which is available on all Amazon platforms and outlets. Thanks again. Bye for now.